Hello, and welcome to Fraud Eats Strategy, a white-collar forensic podcast series in which we explore the myriad ways that financial crime, corruption, and misconduct can derail strategy and cause havoc. I'm Scott Moritz, president of White Collar Forensic, where we assist clients and their outside counsel in managing their response to white-collar crime, money laundering, and bribery incidents, assist in the pursuit of financial recoveries, and help fix the things that were exposed as broken along the way. Thank you for listening. So as we approach year end, many organizations are conducting performance evaluations and are allocating the bonus pool accordingly. And during the performance review process, low performers garner a lot of negative attention, as you might expect. Indeed, one of the more widely recognized red flags in efforts to identify fraud risk is that of a disenfranchised employee, often a subset of the low performer pool. But what if I told you that the opposite may be true, and it's high performers who pose a disproportionate amount of organizational risk? So joining me today is Frontline Anti-Bribery CEO and compliance subject matter expert, Richard Bistrong. In 2007, Richard was targeted by the U.S. Department of Justice in part due to an investigation of a United Nations supply contract and was terminated by his employer. In that same year, as part of a cooperation agreement with the DOJ and subsequent immunity from prosecution in the UK, Richard assisted the U.S., Great Britain, and other governments in their understanding of how FCPA, bribery, and other export violations occurred and operated in international sales. Richard's cooperation, which spanned 3 years of covert cooperation and 2 years of trial prep and testimony, was one of the longest in a white-collar crime investigation. In 2012, following all of that, Richard was sentenced as part of his own plea agreement and served 14 and a half months at a federal prison camp. He was released in December 2013. And for those of you who don't already know who Richard is, you may be asking yourself why and how a former guest of the Federal Bureau of Prisons qualifies as a subject matter expert on compliance. But it's Richard's journey since his personal crucible that more than demonstrates his considerable expertise. Richard now conducts corporate workshops and keynotes to sales, marketing, and business development teams, leadership groups, including boards and C-suite executives and functional leaders, compliance groups, including control functions such as internal audit, finance, and HR. He's presented to hundreds of diverse global multinationals in North America, South America, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. His talks focus on anti-bribery, ethics and compliance challenges, and sharing his frontline experience and perspective on real-world corruption and compliance risk. He shares his journey from corruption to compliance to raise awareness and sensitivity with respect to ethical decision-makings. And his clients include top-tier, widely recognized brands like Volkswagen, Novartis, Airbus, Kraft Heinz, and Microsoft, among other Fortune 100 multinationals and global trade groups. Many of Richard's clients have him come back year after year on a global and regional basis for their annual leadership, compliance, and sales meetings. But what I find amazing is how skilled Richard is in his continued ability to extract fresh, new lessons from his experience and then relate it to numerous types of ethical scenarios that organizations and executives are exposed to every day and how to successfully navigate them. He also has a really unique vantage point on the risks posed by high performers, and I'm eager for the discussion. So welcome, Richard, and thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Scott. Thank you for the very generous introduction. And I'm excited about this conversation about the risk that high performers might present to an organization.
Thanks, Richard. You, or I should say the former you, were one such example of a high performer who posed a considerable amount of risk to your employer before everything went south. So one of the things I so enjoy about your writing and your speaking is the fact that you're a voracious researcher and you credit the many academics and other subject matter experts whose work you reference. So in researching the subject of the risks posed by high performers, what did you learn?
Well, with thanks to my co-authors, Ron Carucci and Dina Denham Smith, we started looking at why high performing employees are more prone to unethical decisions. And hopefully we can link to the Fast Company article in the show notes. And in summary, Scott, I think a lot of this goes back to your introduction, is that organizations are focused, whether it's on performance or potential wrongdoing, is what might our low performing people be doing to shortcut their way to being higher performers, right? So we're spending a lot of time and resources. They could be career development, they might be on your internal audit side, but we're looking at those folks. And then our mid-level performers, I mean, normally we're trying to scale them up, right? And to help them uplift their career to even be better. What we realized in our research is we're not focused on risk and our high performers. We give them what we called in our research a long ethical leash. And we can break this down, but essentially, and I can relate to this from my former commercial self, as you referenced, once you're a high performer and what I, characterize as a corporate hero, you will take more risk to keep that status as a high performer and keep those accolades than you would have taken to get there. So your high performers have a greater sense of impunity. And one of the surprising pieces in our research is that as we're growing in an organization, we're a little bit more self-aware and self-conscious about how our peers look at us. So we're maybe more likely to be ethically self-aware because we want a good reputation in the organization. But when we're a high performer, we could really care less. I mean, that's a simplification, but we're not as concerned about what other people think of us. So how about we start with some of those pillars?
I think that's such important points you make. So in most organizations, there's a pretty big cultural divide between the rainmakers in an organization and the people whose responsibilities are primarily legal and compliance, who are often referred to negatively as like overhead or the business prevention department. So, how important is it to root out the danger signs of a cultural divide, such as the one I was just referencing? And how should organizations tackle negativity or other indicators that signal leadership is kind of tacitly endorsing their rainmakers to make their own rules?
That is a journey. And I think part of it is, look, what we're trying to avoid here is bad behavior hiding behind good performance until it's too late for everyone. And I think we're also trying to mitigate, an exception mentality from your high performers, like I can do what I want, and how sometimes success can block scrutiny. What I've seen a number of organizations do in my client work is the people that have achieved success the right way is to make them your sort of social media influencers and to talk about their experiences and maybe how they took a longer path to success by not sacrificing integrity. Most organizations have wonderful powers of example in how success and integrity work together and how leaders, whether they're commercial or procurement, reached out to their ethics and compliance and integrity team, Scott, as a partner to success, as to saying, look, here's the circumstances that I face. They're pretty ambiguous. I want to make a good decision, but I want to make an informed decision. How can you help me have a balanced mindset between risk and innovation? In summary here, this has to be a corporate narrative. So when your business leaders, the people who the workforce are listening to, particularly your middle level managers, when they are the ones that are sharing ethical expectations, it sounds like here where I work, doing the right thing is everyone's responsibility because it's our corporate narrative, where the organizations that you were referencing and that type of mindset, where ethics and compliance and integrity, we have a compliance team that does all that. Well, there it sounds like a support function. So the more I think we can empower our managers, particularly our middle level managers, because we don't want tone at the top getting frozen in the middle of an organization, because those middle level managers control the volume of getting the business done and the importance of how business gets done, then people, I think, will see where I work, ethics, integrity, commercial success, they're all aligned. I don't feel like Richard Bistrong once felt, like I'm in the middle of competing corporate objectives between the pressure to succeed and the pressure to comply.
Those are really great insights. So earlier, you cited something that I want to delve into a little bit, how high performers may believe that they can act with impunity and that they feel as though they have a moral license to the financial rewards that will come from their business success and their high performance. And, often high performers aren't just motivated exclusively by the financial rewards. Many of them have already achieved great financial benefits and financial success, and their actions may actually be driven by other factors and the accolades that come with being a rainmaker. So I would imagine suggesting to your clients putting guardrails around the most successful rainmakers in an organization may not be met with an enthusiastic response from leadership. And yet, everyone in the organization has to be held to the same ethical standards, no matter how important they may be to the organization's success. How do you strike that balance? What are the approaches to ensure that high performers don't allow their drive to cross those ethical boundaries, and for the organization and their high performers to ignore these obvious danger signs of corruption and fraud?
It's a great question. And I think part of this, and I would, double down on what you shared, it may not be solely the financial rewards, but we can become like addicted to success. That could be a financial success addiction or just success addiction. And again, once we have that in our mindset, we never want to lose it. So I think to mitigate that, a couple of things. Let's talk about sort of the cultural part of it, and then maybe the risk and fraud part of it. I think the cultural part of it is when you look at markets, Scott, they tend to go in like an S curve. Some years are better than others. So when you have your performers that knock it out of the ballpark in a particular reporting quarter, the natural inclination is to say, great, tell us what you're going to do next quarter, with the expectation that you're going to ratchet up success. What I'm about to share will be particularly unpopular, which is, okay, tell us how you got there and what does the market look like over the next quarter or over the next year? Because we also want to make sure that if this is a one-off, and I experienced a lot of that, for example, in the defense field with respect to defense spending, which was huge one-off programs, like we don't want to ratchet up if it's a one-off sale. So tell us about the market, because we don't want our goals for you to run afoul of reality. So we can take a victory lap for what you just achieved, but we don't necessarily want you going after something that's not achievable. Let's have a realistic conversation about what the future looks like. Most public companies are not going to want to have that conversation, right? One of my clients once said, acknowledge success, don't over celebrate it. And I love that saying, right? Because you're not creating, again, that addiction mentality.
You're almost talking about almost the inverse of root cause analysis, right? Not why did we fail so abysmally, and what lessons can be applied here going forward, understanding the root cause of success and what the underlying things that led to our success, are they sustainable, or are there things that contributed to our success that are not sustainable, and that we just need to kind of take that into account in our planning, temper our projections with that reality. And I think that's really interesting. I can't think of too many examples of where that is happening in practice, but I think it's a very important kind of notion to put in people's heads, that it can't simply be math. There has to be more to the setting of sales goals than simply let's just apply some sort of increased percentage over and above what we achieved the prior year. without first factoring in to our thought process some of those drivers that may not exist in the coming year.
Perfectly said. And I think the other side of the house is the risk and fraud and detection side of it. And I think there are some indicators, and this was certainly true in my former career, where you might have someone increasing sales in a declining market. Now, that's a potential red flag in terms of how did we get there? Now, that's a very sensitive subject because if they're doing it the right way, you don't want to damage trust and integrity. So I like to frame it that when we question success in how someone got there, we are increasing trust and integrity in an organization. So I think those are the opportunities to sit down with someone in a way that is not accusatory and is not going to put someone in the defensive, and to say, look, we're getting crushed in our other market segments. You have an uncanny ability to increase sales in a very volatile market, which we're seeing a lot of right now. What we'd like to know is how you did it.
Right.
Because if you're doing it and you're doing it the right way, you know what? We should put you on a road show and help.
We want to extrapolate it, not, take away from what you're doing, but, we want to learn from you and how, we can, use that to our greatest advantage. You certainly don't want to, take your high performers and immediately put them on the defensive after they had a record year. It's more, hey, let's develop as deep an understanding of why you were as successful as you were, so that we can hopefully build on it, but also, take into consideration some of those things that might have been one-offs. So,
And I would add to that, Scott, and this was certainly the case, and I think it continues to be the case, is when people are successful, we tend to give them more autonomy in terms of discretions with respect to maybe discounting or marketing allowances or the sort of financial arrangements between company leaders and external parties, whether they're counterparties or business partners, third parties. So if in this conversation you're getting ambiguous answers and you're not getting a sense of clarity for how this was done, what I would suggest to organizations is to say, until we have a better idea of how this is operating, instead of giving you more autonomy and discretion, we just might put some more guardrails around your discretionary matrix so that you've got a little bit less authority. You're going to have to come to us a little more often for permission. But again, we're not doing this in a way that's accusing you of anything, but just from a control standpoint and in a financial obligations, we need to know how this is working. And then you're going to make it difficult for someone. And like in my case, that would have been like pulling a thread out of a sweater, and it would have started collapsing well before it took the investigators 10 years to find out about it.
I often kind of talk about the MBA approach to looking at opportunities, these SWOT analyses. And a big part of that process is understanding the W and the T, the threats and the weaknesses, and how infrequently the threats and weaknesses are giving voice to the risk of fraud, the risk of corruption, the risk of misconduct that could threaten the business opportunity that is otherwise under in-depth consideration. And if you don't, at least, in part, take those things under consideration, you've created, a strategic plan in a vacuum. You've, either consciously or unconsciously disregarded some very significant threats and weaknesses. Um, so, um, um, so there's a reason compensation that's tied to financial outcomes is called incentive compensation. But sometimes the way that organizations measure and recognize success can really lead to unintended consequences, and in some instances, like perverse behavior. I worked for a number of such organizations in which the company's interests really were not well aligned with what was best for clients. And in one such situation, incentives encourage the use of personnel within a specific region or business unit even though doing so would result in increased travel costs or other inefficiencies that would negatively impact the client. And in another situation, the partner level personnel had to allocate sales credit to members of their team, but doing so would actually reduce the amount of revenue credit that they were receiving, which inevitably would lead to greedy and eventually toxic behavior and a toxic culture. So, how important is it to look at the mechanisms of incentive compensation frameworks to identify the kind of structures that encourage negative behavior?
So I like to, I don't want to over metaphor it, but when I hear incentive, I hear at risk, right? Because if you don't make your goal, your incentive compensation is at risk. And I look at incentives and rewards like prescription medications. You take that bottle, you turn it on its side, and it's going to have those scary side effects. All incentives and rewards have side effects. And the question is, are teams looking at those side effects to make sure that they align with codes of conduct, with company values, with company behaviors? Unfortunately, Scott, the data and the survey data indicates that our ethics and compliance leaders are not there when those incentives and rewards are being developed. So, for example, we're talking about dangerous reward systems. My former reward system was if I made 90% of my objectives on a quarterly basis, I got 90% of my bonus. And my bonus was equal and greater to my base compensation. If I made 100% of my objectives on a quarterly basis, I actually got 105% of bonus. So it was like a hockey stick. It ratcheted up once I exceeded that. Now, if I made 88% of my objectives and forecast on a quarterly basis, I got no bonus. So think about what you would do, or maybe better said, what I did for that last 2%, right? And there's a behavioral concept called escalation of commitment, which is if we see that goal line and if we see the finish line and it's right in front of us, but we're not quite yet there, we will take a lot of risk to get there. And that's a cliff reward system. So I think we need to continue to be on the lookout and to have these conversations as a team to make sure that incentives are well aligned. And in my client work, I've seen some really cool incentive systems. You have to get a little creative, but they won't put someone in the position of, what do I want? Do I want to abide by all this paperwork that I've signed, or do I want my bonus this quarter? We don't want people feeling that way.
I was talking about some of my expert matters that I'm working on. One of them has to do with that very thing. They were driving toward, like a bonus, and it at least seemed outwardly to influence a lot of what was going on at the behest of things that should have been going on. So important. So earlier in my career, I recall working with a colleague on a huge pitch for a project for another much larger professional services firm. So, a professional services firm pitching another one on a project. And he was insistent on something that at the time, I found unusual, that we asked the client how they will define and measure success on a project that we were proposing. Like I said, at first I found it strange, but then I realized it actually forced us to kind of look at what we were proposing through the lens of what the client is hoping to achieve and what is top of mind for them, which isn't necessarily exactly what what we're thinking. So I thought that was really great, and it was really helpful, and it's something that stays with me. I probably should call him and tell him that this has had such a profound impact on my way of thinking. But what can organizations do to ensure that their incentive comp encourages and recognizes wins, while at the same time aligns those rewards with what the client is hoping to achieve, the end user customer is hoping to achieve?
Well, I think part of defining success is also defining failure. Because when you look at the fraud triangle and pressures and opportunities, I think people react on what's the worst case scenario. So the definition of success is usually easier, Scott, right? Because it's based on, okay, we want to meet these goals. Hopefully they're all client centric, right? That the goals of the individual align with the goals of the client. But I think it's also not easy, but it's very helpful for people to understand or to see examples of when those goals weren't met. What happened? Was there a get well plan put into place? Was there a root cause analysis as to, okay, why did we fail? You know, Amy Edmondson in her book, The Science of Failing Well, talks about intelligent failures. Did we fail for the right reasons? Did we fail because we walked away from an opportunity that we should have walked away from because of the risk? Or did we not execute on our marketing strategy the way we should have? So when people see if there is a failure, we have a process here that's very productive to take a look at what happened and how we could try not to have it happen again. Where if an organization, if it's constantly seeing, if you fail around here, you may get away with like 1 quarter or 2 quarters. But if you're failing like 2 or 3 quarters in a row, you're pretty much out the door. So that's going to normalize fear that if I don't make my number, I'm out of here. Where if I circumvent a policy, what are the odds that I'm going to get caught? And what are the odds if I get caught, I'm going to get in trouble? I was an irrational calculator of risk. Numbers were not abstract. Concepts of ethics and compliance and doing the right thing were more abstract. So again, I think when we talk about failure, when we normalize it, people are more likely to surface their issues than to bury them. And they're more likely to talk about a problem instead of, again, circumventing something for their own gain.
Well, it's so important for people, high performers and otherwise, to understand that the expectation isn't winning 100% of the time, isn't achieving every goal without failure. If these unrealistic expectations are created and the notion of failure, that no one ever gives a voice to it, but creates an added level of pressure that, high performers certainly don't need any more pressure that they put on them than they already put on themselves. But yeah, if you take away that recognition that, yeah, it's unrealistic to think that we're going to be successful in every endeavor that we pursue, you're creating these unrealistic expectations, and that together with other factors can lead to some pretty bad outcomes.
Let me just share an example because we can make this real. One of my clients, they had, look, we've all probably been to these events. It's the commercial global event, and there's going to be the big celebration of who made the top 10 club, right? In terms of financial performance. And, that person's on stage, there's awards, there's accolades, all this great stuff. And again, that person's like, I want to be back in Hawaii next year too. What do I need to do that? But in this case, the CEO, after they brought their top performer on, talked about someone who stopped a piece of business on the procurement side with a contractor that ended up disrupting the supply chain and the ability to deliver the product. And it also had like an impact on how this person was measured. This person took a little bit of a haircut for doing the right thing. And the CEO at this leadership conference brought that person up on stage and handed him a check to say, this is the bonus you would have got, if you ignored these red flags, and had us gone into what could have been a high risk and regulatory issue. And you navigated us away from that, and you deserve to be rewarded for that.
Example. So often when you and I both are called upon to kind of look at compliance programs and frameworks through a critical lens, so many companies, at least in my own experience, miss the mark on the positive reinforcement aspects of compliance. If you're using the terms carrot and stick, there's always a stick, but for reasons that I can't understand, most organizations are loath to kind of calling out and calling attention to people who did what was right, what was ethical, even though it might have negatively impacted the company from a short-term gain that might have happened. And it's just It's so overlooked. You praise on somebody for doing what's right because you don't see it that often. What a great message to be able to convey across the organization. It goes beyond tone at the top, right? Tone at the top, it's like a lofty concept. It's the actions of the leadership team, and that's an action of the leadership team that has a potentially a profound impact on everybody. That's a really cool example that you just gave.
Yeah, I guarantee if you go to it, speak to an attendee that was there, and you say, well, who won the award for that year? They probably won't remember, but they'll remember that someone like that did the right thing that cost the company a huge chunk of business got a bonus check for doing that. That's the thing that people remember.
That is monumental, and really what a great example. So let's talk a little about another concept that you've and your co-authors raised in the article, loss aversion, which is when high performers take an increase on increasing levels of risk. You touched upon it earlier, or worse, they ignore the risks altogether because they're not being driven by anything other than the fear that they won't meet their numbers. So what have some organizations done to dignify, and we've talked a little bit about this already, that revenue fluctuates, competitors sometimes prevail, and the organization is acknowledging and recognizing that there will be peaks and valleys, and it's expected.
So I think some of the more informed organizations where they appreciate particularly market fluctuations when it comes to new markets or new products, where you don't have the sort of market data that you can pin your expectations on, there's more risk when we're engaging in these new forms of marketing. Again, it could be product, it could be region oriented. And what I've seen clients do is sort of go out to the sales team and go out to the marketing team well in advance and to say, look, this is what we're thinking in your experience and what are you thinking? And the other part is, from a control perspective, is if we're not on solid ground about who our responsible business partner should be in this particular market, is it worth the investment of the due diligence resources that we're going to need to find responsible counterparties? So I think a lot of this involves, let's have the discussion far in advance, because really, once we set these numbers, and if we're a public company, we're going out to the market with them, it's a little bit more difficult to course correct midstream. I think it's like a continuous communication loop and a proactive communication loop where the numbers just aren't running downhill, but before you put those numbers out, you're soliciting input going uphill. And every salesperson wants the easiest forecast as possible. Management wants you to put it way out of reach. But that's not a fair process. I mean, you want a little bit of a stretch goal, but you don't want it running afoul of reality. And that was one of the articles we researched. It was called Goals Gone Wild, which I think says it all. And then I think the other part of this, Scott, and I think this is very important messaging, and this goes to loss aversion, is if during a sales process or a procurement process, something goes wrong. So in other words, those goods are sitting at an inspection dock in a foreign country. You've already got this built into your budget, your forecast. We're getting ready to get our letter of credit signed off on and get this done with. And now you're being held up for, a bribe to get these goods through. Talk to us about it. Don't feel that you need to sidestep controls because you're so close. Because as I experience, and I think we still see this, risk can sometimes increase right at the last stage of a process. So I think we need to positively acknowledge that that can exist. And another one of my clients, I think, has a great process, and it's a public company. They actually take reserves against this, have a budget to where if someone from the sales team says, guess what? I know we've got a letter of credit running out. We've got 10 days to get these goods inspected. It's not going to happen. They're being held up by a customs official. The company says, it's not your problem anymore. We need to retain counsel. We need to deal with this. But we have a reserve bonus pool, and we're paying you the bonus as if that sale happened because you did the right thing and you did the right thing at the last minute. Whereas coming to us a day before your quarter expires and say, I didn't make my number because I didn't pay a bribe, you know what? That sounds like an excuse. But if you come to us early and let us know what's happening, we take care of it. It's not on your shoulders anymore. And here's the check for doing the right thing as if the sale did happen.
So important. And it segues very nicely into the next question, which is walking away from or turning down business for any reason may cause some high performers to react the way that a dog might when it hears a funny noise, like cock their head and look confused. But regulators and prosecutors, we can wax very poetically about all of the wonderful bells and whistles in our compliance program and internal controls until one of the prosecutors or regulators asks a very pointed question and says, well, tell us about situations in which you walked away from business and why you did it and what led you to make that decision. You better have an answer that is, that aligns with the question, right? What can organizations do to instill in their high performers that not all business is good business and that it's okay to walk away sometimes? In fact, we need to.
Who knows risk better than the people that are working in the middle of it? So I like to think of things as signals. So if you're signaling to your high performers, look, we want business that's sustainable, and we want success where we don't have to look over our shoulders to have that regulatory conversation. We're not risk neutral. What we are is we want to be informed about risk. We're not saying we're not taking any risk, but we need to know about it. So if there are market forces and issues in your marketplace that are disruptive to good ethical decision making and sustainable business, tell us about it. And I think this goes back to the conversation, Scott, of first of all, let's look at the market size. I mean, if it's an enormous opportunity, it might be worth to invest in forensic resources, in legal resources to make sure that we're engaging with the right counterparties. In some countries, certain sectors are less corrupt than others. So I think it's bad to just brand bad a whole country because there are good sectors and there are not good sectors. So these are very detailed discussions to where you can then say, you know what, based on this market size and potential, it probably just doesn't make sense for us. I mean, because we have to invest these resources before we do business, not while we're doing business, or maybe both. So let's have a educated and informed discussion. And there might be a little friction there, Scott. And I love friction because when people are having constructive and difficult conversations, it means they're talking about real world risk. So I'm a big fan of organizational friction in having these difficult discussions.
Agreed. You got to have friction. So speaking of which, years ago, I had a colleague who was an absolutely brilliant practitioner and very rarefied rainmaker air. He was also a very abusive human being, and it wasn't at all unusual to see people leaving his office sobbing. And the company ignored his toxic and abusive behavior because of his results. And, he's certainly not a unicorn. In my experience, I've worked with, several people that were very similar. So when leadership sanctions toxic behavior from its high performers, what does normalizing toxic behavior do to an organizational culture? And how can well-meaning organizations avoid becoming the worst common denominator?
So you've hit on my next Fast Company article, and maybe it'll be out by the time the podcast comes out. Look at who you're promoting. So take that person that you just talked about, which was probably an open secret, right? Maybe no one was talking about his or her toxicity, but everybody knew it was going on. When you take a person like that and you're promoting them in the organization, you are basically signaling this is the dominating narrative, right? And how you get to be successful and how you are measured in the organization. This is what we promote. So lately I've been focusing a lot on what you're promoting and who you're promoting. And are you promoting toxic leadership? Or are you saying, no, it doesn't matter how high you are in the org chart. If you're role modeling toxic behavior, it certainly isn't promotable and it's not acceptable either. We look at people's ethics and integrity maybe during the onboarding process, maybe during the interview process. But Scott, I mean, I'm looking and, we're in the last quarter of 2025, we're seeing a lot of CEOs get into trouble. We're seeing a lot of high level executives get into trouble. Well, guess what? They have been at their organization for sometimes decades and they've been promoted in their organizations. So, what's going on out there that by the time this toxicity is exposed, it's on the front page of the New York Times or the Financial Times? So, that's something that I think we're not paying enough attention to.
That's a really good point. Like cultures don't become toxic overnight. They evolve and it takes a long time. And it takes arguably even longer to set them on the right path. So, Richard, one last thing before you go. I always find what you do in your career so interesting. You recently joined the advisory board of Leonid Group Limited, which is an executive search firm, and they're focused on recruiting in the ethics and compliance field. So, what can you tell the audience about Leonid? What's your role and what attracted you to them?
So it's interesting, Scott, in that there's no shortage of search firms and recruitment firms out there. What I found interesting about Leonid, and I got to know some of their leaders in my travels and in their travels. Number one, they're focused exclusively in what we do: ethics, risk, compliance, investigations. And they have a process, it's called the Magic Month, where they really focus on delivering candidates that have been vetted and calibrated to the organizational needs of a specific role. So it's not this shotgun approach that you might see, for example, on LinkedIn, where you see a posting and then, might see thousands of people, if you look at the numbers, applying, and it's all over the board. And it's also overwhelming to human resources and the recruitment managers and the hiring managers. So Leonid has just this wonderful workflow to where they will ask the organization, what matters to you? What are the 4 or 5 questions that you would ask for a candidate? And then they look at their pool of candidates, and each individual at Leonid are only working on usually 2 or 3 searches at once. It's a quality approach, not a quantity approach. And then they will deliver the video interviews, usually within a few weeks, of what they feel are the 3, 4, or 5 best candidates for that role. And then it's up to the company and the candidate for the second round of interviews. So if you look at, number one, the cost of a bad hire or a hire that doesn't work out, doing it on your own, I've seen the numbers. It's, you have a candidate for 9 months or 6 months, it doesn't work out. You now are going to spend probably another year of salary re-recruiting. So I think the value proposition is very strong at getting it right the first time. And what I also really enjoy about Leonid is they are open and honest because they see the global markets. If you're recruiting for a role and you have salary expectations, responsibility expectations, they'll give you honest feedback as to what sort of candidates they can deliver in that matrix. And they'll be very honest in sharing if they think it's fit for purpose or maybe the company should reconsider it. And it's also a beginning to end process. They stay in touch with their clients to make sure that the onboarding's going well. It's a very holistic approach. They'll stay in touch with a candidate. It's not like a one and done, hey, hope you guys are, doing well. They really have so many different touch points from the interviewing process all the way to the onboarding process. And I count a number of my friends and colleagues that have worked with Leonid both on the getting hired and the hiring side, and they've been wonderful and long-term relationships. So it's a pleasure to work just like yourself, Scott, with like-minded people and to explore common challenges and to find good solutions.
It's interesting. And what you're saying about these job postings and the importance of kind of giving feedback to the company relative to their position they're trying to fill and what their salary parameters are. Those two things, if they're not well aligned, one could argue is symptomatic of someone's commitment to a strong ethical culture. If they create this really lofty, elite sort of experience and skill set expectation in the job description, and then they come up with some real lowball number. First of all, it limits very significantly the talent pool, and also kind of just signals that this company devalues the role. Not suggesting that every chief compliance officer should be making seven figures, but nor should they be paid 80 grand. What's that expression? You think compliance expensive? Why don't you try non-compliance?
Right. We've seen those numbers.
Well, this has been great. I enjoy our conversation so much. One that we've chosen to share with everybody, and I so appreciate your time.
Scott, it's a pleasure. So thanks so much for the invitation to join you today, and to our listeners.
Hey, thanks, Richard. So that was Richard Bistrong, the CEO of Frontline Anti-Bribery. This concludes this episode of Fraud Eats Strategy. I'm Scott Moritz, president of White Collar Forensic, and thanks for listening. Stay tuned for the next episode of Fraud Eats Strategy. But in the meantime, if you have an idea about a fraud or corruption case, a topic or guest that you'd like to hear about in a future episode, email us through our website at whitecollarforensic.com. Thank you for listening.